city of Fort Wayne called it a municipal park amenity. In truth, it was a collection of concrete pits built in the 1920s when standards for animal welfare barely existed beyond keeping creatures alive. American zoos of the early 20th century followed a template imported from European menageries. Animals lived in barred cages arranged in rows like prisoners. The design prioritized human viewing angles over the psychological needs of captive wildlife. Between 1910 and 1940, over 200 municipal zoos opened across the United States. Most were funded through property taxes and managed by park departments. Few employed trained zoologists. The goal was civic pride, not conservation. Construction methods reflected the era's materials and assumptions. Reinforced concrete promised durability. Steel bars provided visibility. The combination created structures that could last decades without maintenance, which officials interpreted as an excuse to provide none. Safety protocols were minimal. The American Association of Zoological Parks and Aquariums would not establish formal guidelines until 1942. Before then, each facility improvised its own procedures. Some worked, many did not. Records from the 1930s documented keeper injuries at rates approaching 12 per thousand employees annually across American facilities. Most incidents involved minor trauma. A smaller subset involved permanent disability or death. Cities treated these as acceptable operational costs. Fort Wayne's facility opened in 1924. The design mimicked successful models from cities like Cleveland and Detroit. Concrete walls formed rectangular enclosures. Metal grates covered the tops. Visitors stood at railings 3 feet from the bars. Forest Park Zoo occupied a corner of the city's green space. No fences separated the public walkways from the aged structures housing lions and bears. Families visited on Sundays, unaware that the metal doors operated by hand. The facility ran on property tax revenue. Every dollar spent on cages meant less for roads. Officials chose maintenance only when failure became visible. Rust accumulated silently on hinges and bolts that had not been replaced in decades. Park commissioners managed the operation without zoological training. They approved budgets from offices downtown, never walking the service corridors where keepers maneuvered pulleys to shift animals between compartments. Distance bred indifference. Operating costs focused on salaries and feed. Capital improvements constituted less than 5% of annual spending between 1945 and 51. The guillotine doors that sealed the lion enclosure relied on cables installed before the war. The barrier system was mechanical simplicity itself. A steel plate weighing 200 pounds hung from a cable threaded through ceiling-mounted pulleys. The keeper pulled a lever. The plate descended into floor channels, sealing the opening. A locking pin engaged automatically when the barrier reached bottom position. The pin was mild steel, 3/4 of an inch in diameter, heat-treated for hardness. It passed through aligned holes in the barrier frame and the floor bracket. The design assumed the pin would resist forces from below. Lions could push against the barrier, but the locked pin would hold. The assumption was correct when the metal was new. It became fatally incorrect after 28 years of service. Metal fatigue occurs invisibly. Each cycle of load and release creates microscopic fractures in the crystal structure. Over thousands of cycles, the fractures propagate. The metal appears intact until sudden catastrophic failure occurs under routine load. The climate of northern Indiana accelerated corrosion. Winter freeze-thaw cycles stressed the metal. Summer humidity promoted oxidation. The service corridor lacked ventilation. Moisture condensed on cold metal surfaces. Rust formed where the pin entered the bracket. Engineering studies from the period showed that mild steel, exposed to cyclical loading, and moisture typically exhibited 50% reduction in fatigue life. No such studies informed the design of Forest Park Zoo. The builders worked from intuition and precedent. A keeper named Harold worked to the predator section. He arrived before dawn to prepare meat, checked water troughs, and manipulated the lever systems that controlled access between indoor dens and outdoor yards. The routine demanded precision in dim light. Harold had worked at Forest Park Zoo for 9 years. He started in 1943, shortly after returning from military service. His personnel file recorded no disciplinary actions. Supervisors rated his performance as reliable. The lion enclosure featured 2 compartments. A female named Sasha occupied the front section, visible to visitors. The rear chamber served as a holding area during cleaning. A sliding barrier separated the spaces, operated by a pulley mounted to the ceiling. Harold had reported jamming in the mechanism 3 times that winter. Each time maintenance applied grease and declared the system functional. No engineer examined the cable for fraying or tested the lock's integrity under load. The work orders existed in municipal archives. January 15th, barrier sticks halfway down, applied lubricant to track. February 3rd, difficult to engage lock, cleaned debris from pinhole. March 9th. Lever requires excessive force, adjusted cable tension. None of the reports triggered a comprehensive safety review. The maintenance department operated reactively. They fixed reported problems without investigating root causes. The approach minimized immediate costs while accumulating long-term risk. Other American cities experienced similar patterns. In 1948, a keeper in Indianapolis sustained serious injuries when a cage door failed. In 1950, a Detroit facility reported a near miss involving a bear enclosure. No national database compiled these incidents. The absence of centralized reporting meant each city repeated the same mistakes independently. Information sharing between municipal zoo operations was informal at best. Professional conferences for zookeepers did not yet exist. Institutional memory resided in individual facilities. On an April morning in 1952, Harold entered the service corridor to prepare the rear chamber. Protocol required verifying that Sasha remained secured in the front section. He checked the position of the barrier through a viewing slot. The slot was 6 inches square, positioned at eye level. Through it, Harold could see the bottom edge of the barrier seated in the floor channel. What he could not see was the fractured locking pin behind the metal plate. What Harold could not see was the partial failure of the locking pin. Metal fatigue had fractured the bolt at its base. The barrier held position only through friction, not mechanical engagement. Any pressure from the animal's side would dislodge it. The fracture surface, later examined by police investigators, showed classic fatigue patterns. Beach marks radiated from a corrosion pit where the pin passed through the bracket. The final fracture zone, less than 20% of the cross-section, broke suddenly. Harold entered the rear chamber, carrying a bucket and scrub brush. The space was 12 feet long and 8 feet wide. A drain occupied the center. The walls were bare concrete. A single bulb provided illumination from a ceiling fixture. He set the bucket down and began scrubbing the floor. His back faced the barrier. The sound of water sloshing masked other noises. The temperature in the corridor was 48 degrees. His breath formed vapor in the air. Sasha weighed 300 pounds. She had learned that pushing against the barrier sometimes yielded movement, especially during feeding when impatience ran high. That morning, she applied force while Harold worked 10 feet away, his back turned. The barrier shifted 6 inches. The gap was sufficient. Sasha's head and shoulders passed through as the metal panel pivoted on its track. Harold heard the scrape of iron on concrete and turned to see her emerging into the corridor. He reached for the emergency pole mounted on the wall. The distance was 4 feet. Sasha covered the space in less than 2 seconds. Her jaws closed on his shoulder, and he fell. The attack lasted under a minute before another keeper arrived and used a fire hose. The second keeper, a man named Raymond, heard Harold shout from the adjacent building. He grabbed the nearest response tool, a high-pressure hose used for washing enclosures. The water struck Sasha at a distance of 8 feet, forcing her back. Raymond activated the emergency alarm. The sound brought 2 more staff members within 90 seconds. They used poles to keep Sasha contained while Raymond entered the corridor. Harold was unconscious. Blood pooled beneath his shoulder and neck. The ambulance crew found Harold unconscious from blood loss. He died en route to the hospital. Police photographed the scene. The broken locking pin lay on the floor. Investigators labeled the incident mechanical failure, but recommended no criminal charges against the city. The police report, filed as case number 52-417, documented the physical evidence. Photographs showed the fractured pin, the displaced barrier, and blood spatter patterns, consistent with the location Raymond had described. The coroner's report documented trauma consistent with a large predator attack. It noted that safety protocols existed on paper but lacked enforcement mechanisms. The document suggested that the facility's age contributed to systemic risk, but stopped short of demanding closure. Dr. Martin Fisher conducted the autopsy. His report identified the cause of death as exsanguination, secondary to penetrating trauma of the subclavian artery. The mechanism of injury was consistent with large felid dentition. Time of death occurred approximately 40 minutes after the attack. Fort Wayne's newspapers ran the story on front pages. The Journal-Gazette published a front-page article on April 18th. The headline read, "Zookeeper Killed in Lion Attack." The article quoted the police chief, who emphasized equipment failure, not human error. The News Sentinel followed with an editorial questioning the zoo's safety standards. The piece noted that Harold had filed multiple maintenance requests in the months before his death. It asked whether city officials had ignored warnings. Letters to the editor appeared throughout the following weeks. A visitor who had brought her children to the zoo the previous month wrote that she would never return. A retired city engineer noted that the facility's age alone constituted grounds for comprehensive inspection. A former keeper, who had left employment in 1950, submitted a letter describing conditions in the service corridors. He noted that staff had nicknamed the lion enclosure the Gamble, due to unreliable barriers. The newspaper published the letter without editorial comment. City officials convened an emergency meeting. Legal advisors warned that civil liability now extended beyond theoretical risk. If another incident occurred, negligence claims would succeed in court. The city attorney, Thomas Brennan, prepared a memorandum for the Park Commission. He outlined the municipality's exposure to wrongful death litigation. Harold's widow could argue that the city knew about the defective equipment and failed to repair it. Maintenance crews welded reinforcement plates onto the barriers within days. The city allocated emergency funds for immediate repairs, but rejected proposals for comprehensive redesign. The welding held the structure together without addressing underlying obsolescence. The emergency appropriation totaled $8,000. The money paid for steel plates, welding labor, and replacement of the most obviously corroded hardware. It did not fund structural analysis or redesign of the barrier systems. Attendance dropped by 40% over the following months. Families chose different Sunday activities. Revenue from concessions fell. The zoo operated at a loss, subsidized entirely by municipal budgets, already strained by post-war infrastructure demands. The attendance records showed the decline clearly. Average weekly visitors fell from 1,200 in March to 700 in June. By August, the number had stabilized at around 500. The facility was no longer economically viable. Staff morale deteriorated. Keepers worked with heightened anxiety. Aware that every shift involved potential failure of equipment they could neither repair nor replace. The union filed grievances about unsafe conditions. The grievance document filed in July by the Municipal Employees Union, Local 473, detailed 17 specific safety concerns. These included corroded cage bars, defective locks, inadequate emergency equipment, and insufficient staffing levels. Management responded with procedural memos that changed nothing structural. By 1955, the facility had entered a state of managed decline. Animals received care, but no new exhibits opened. Repairs addressed only immediate hazards. The zoo became a burden officials hoped would fade from public consciousness through gradual neglect. The service corridor where Harold died was closed permanently. The lions were moved to a different enclosure. The barrier that had failed was removed entirely. The space became a storage area. No memorial marked the location. A businessman named Earl Wells visited the zoo with his children that year. He observed the cracked concrete, the improvised barriers, the absence of educational programming. Wells had connections to philanthropic networks and experience in civic projects. Wells owned a successful manufacturing company. He had served on the Chamber of Commerce and the board of several charitable foundations. He believed that civic institutions reflected a community's values. The decaying zoo embarrassed him. Wells assembled a group of investors and civic leaders. They proposed not renovation but replacement. A new facility in a different location, designed from the ground up with modern standards. The pitch emphasized child safety and education. The initial meeting occurred in Wells' office in January 1956. Attendees included 3 business owners, a banker, the superintendent of schools, and a representative from the Park Commission. Wells presented a vision, a children's zoo that would educate. City officials welcomed the proposal. It offered escape from liability without requiring them to admit failure. If private donors funded most construction, the municipality could support the project through land allocation and operational subsidies once the facility opened. Planning for the new zoo began in 1957. Wells and his team studied recent developments in zoological design. They visited facilities in Milwaukee and Cincinnati, noting innovations in habitat simulation and visitor flow. The Milwaukee County Zoo, opened in 1958, became a key reference. Its exhibits featured naturalistic barriers, moats replaced bars, landscaping concealed fences. Visitors experienced immersion in the animal's world rather than viewing specimens through metal grates. The planning committee hired landscape architects from Chicago. The firm had experience with park design, but not zoos. This was deliberate. Wells wanted fresh thinking, unconstrained by traditions that had produced the failures of Forest Park Zoo. Design discussions focused on eliminating direct contact between animals and humans. Every barrier would have redundancy. If one system failed, a backup would prevent escape. The engineering philosophy was defense in depth. Moats replaced most caging. The principle was simple. Animals would not cross water barriers if the width exceeded their jumping distance. The moats were dry on the visitor side, water-filled on the animal side. Mechanical barriers used stainless steel instead of mild steel. Stainless resisted corrosion and fatigue. Locks featured dual engagement. If one pin failed, a second prevented movement. The redundancy increased cost by 30%, but eliminated single points of failure. Franca Park offered acreage outside the city's dense core. The site had room for expansion and natural topography that could be incorporated into exhibit design. Architects drafted plans that eliminated metal bars in favor of moats and concealed barriers. The Franca Park site encompassed 80 acres of rolling terrain with mature trees. A creek ran through the property. The topography allowed for natural elevation changes that could define exhibit boundaries without constructed walls. Fundraising took 3 years. Wells contributed the first major gift, $100,000. Other donors followed. The city committed land and infrastructure improvements. The total project cost reached $700,000. Construction commenced in 1962. The old Forest Park Zoo continued operating during this period, its condition worsening month by month. Paint peeled from signage, pathways cracked. The contrast between the decaying present and the promised future became stark. The construction phase employed local labor. Contractors graded the land, installed drainage, and poured concrete for paths and service buildings. The work proceeded deliberately. Rushing would replicate the mistakes of Forest Park. Each exhibit was tested before animals arrived. Engineers measured moat widths. They verified that barrier heights exceeded the jumping and climbing abilities of the intended species. They tested gates under load. They simulated failure scenarios. Fort Wayne. Children's Zoo opened in 1965. Families arrived to find landscaped paths winding through exhibits where animals move freely within naturalistic boundaries. Educational staff explained ecology and conservation. The opening day drew 5,000 visitors. Local television stations broadcast live. The mayor spoke about community pride and progress. Wells stood beside him, credited as the driving force behind the project. Neither mentioned Harold. Forest Park Zoo closed within weeks of the new opening. Maintenance ceased immediately. Animals were evaluated for transfer. Those compatible with the children's zoo concept moved to Franca Park. Others were sold to facilities willing to accept aging stock. Sasha the lioness was not transferred. Her age and behavioral history made her unsuitable for a children's zoo. A facility in Columbus, Ohio, agreed to take her. She was transported in September 1965. Records indicate she died of natural causes in February 1966. The demolition crew arrived in autumn. They dismantled the enclosures systematically, hauling away metal and concrete. The land reverted to green space within the park. Within 2 years, grass covered the areas where cages had stood. Demolition required 6 weeks. Workers used cutting torches on the steel bars and jackhammers on the concrete. The debris filled 30 truckloads. Some metal was sold as scrap. The concrete was crushed and used as fill for road projects. Harold's death received no memorial at the site. His family received a settlement from the city's insurance fund. The terms included confidentiality clauses. Public records noted the incident but provided minimal detail. The settlement amount was not disclosed publicly, but insurance records later obtained through open records requests showed a payment of $25,000 to Harold's widow. The agreement required her to release the city from further liability. The new zoo thrived. Attendance exceeded projections. School groups scheduled field trips. The facility earned accreditation from the American Association of Zoological Parks and Aquariums within 3 years. Annual attendance reached 100,000 by 1968. Revenue from admissions and concessions exceeded operating costs. The facility achieved financial sustainability faster than projections had predicted. City planners incorporated lessons from the Forest Park experience into future projects. Infrastructure reviews became mandatory. Liability assessments preceded operational decisions. The cost of prevention was weighed against the cost of lawsuits and lives. Municipal liability insurance policies changed after Harold's death. Insurers required annual safety inspections of all high-risk facilities. Premiums increased for cities that failed to demonstrate adequate maintenance programs. The financial pressure accomplished what moral arguments had not. The iron door that failed in 1952 was likely melted down for scrap. The cable that frayed under stress was discarded with other debris. Physical evidence vanished, but the consequences persisted in policy documents and engineering standards. Fort Wayne's population grew through the 60s and 70s. Younger residents never knew the old zoo existed. Forest Park remained a popular recreational area. Joggers and picnickers used the space where predators once paced behind bars. Historians later examined municipal records to understand the transition. They found budget reports showing minimal investment in the old facility, correspondence revealing bureaucratic inertia, and legal memoranda calculating risk. The archival research conducted in the 1990s by a graduate student from Indiana University produced a thesis titled Public Safety and Municipal Liability: The Fort Wayne Zoo Transition. The document remained the most comprehensive analysis of institutional failures. The story of Forest Park Zoo was not unique. Across America, aging facilities from the early 20th century faced similar decisions. Some renovated, others closed. A few experienced tragedies that forced action. What distinguished Fort Wayne was the rapidity of replacement. Between Harold's death and the new zoo's opening, only 13 years passed. Many cities took decades to transition. The presence of Earl Wells and his network accelerated the process. The concrete pits of Forest Park Zoo represented an era when animals were curiosities and safety was an afterthought. The naturalistic habitats of the Children's Zoo represented an era when education and conservation shaped design. Visitors to modern Fort Wayne Children's Zoo can find historical displays about the facility's origins. They mention Earl Wells and the community effort to build something new. They do not dwell on the blood that made the project urgent. Yet the truth persists in archives accessible to those who search. Police photographs show the corridor. Maintenance logs document the ignored warnings. Budget reports reveal the priorities that left equipment unrepaired. Fort Wayne is not unique in this regard. Every modern institution carries buried narratives of failure that preceded improvement. The question is whether those stories inform current decisions or remain hidden to protect reputations. The land where Harold died now hosts a playground. Children climb structures designed to meet contemporary safety codes. Inspectors certify the equipment annually. Insurance requirements mandate regular review. The mechanisms that failed in 1952 have counterparts today, but the culture of maintenance has evolved. Whether that evolution is permanent or cyclical remains uncertain. Budget pressures persist. Infrastructure ages. Bureaucracies still defer expensive decisions. The factors that led to Harold's death exist in latent form. Engineering students study the case in courses on failure analysis. The fractured locking pin appears in textbooks as an example of fatigue failure. The photographs from the police investigation illustrate how invisible damage accumulates. Harold's personnel file remained in city archives until 1995, when old records were transferred to microfilm. The file contained his employment application, performance reviews, and the work orders he had submitted. Someone reviewing the microfilm noted the pattern of warnings and wrote, "Preventable," in the margin. Decades after the last concrete pit was demolished, Fort Wayne Children's Zoo continues to operate. It has expanded multiple times, adding exhibits and educational programs. It employs descendants of the keepers who worked in Forest Park. Current staff receive training that would have been unimaginable in Harold's era. They learn animal behavior, veterinary basics, emergency response, and equipment inspection. The culture emphasizes proactive maintenance. Problems are addressed before they become hazards. Harold's name appears in historical records accessible to researchers. His death is documented in newspaper archives and municipal reports. He is remembered not as a martyr, but as a casualty of systemic failure. The distinction matters. Martyrdom implies choice. Casualty acknowledges forces beyond individual control. Fort Wayne addressed its failure through replacement rather than repair. This choice reflected pragmatic assessment of the old facility's condition. No amount of welding could transform 1920s infrastructure into modern standards. The Children's Zoo that emerged from this recognition has educated millions of visitors. It has contributed to conservation programs and species survival efforts. Its success justifies the decision to close Forest Park Zoo. Yet justification should not erase the cost. Progress and tragedy coexist in the record. The forest park where the zoo once stood remains beautiful. Trees shade the paths, families gather for picnics. The space serves its intended purpose as public recreation area. Nothing visible suggests that tragedy once occurred there. But erasure is not forgetting. The documents survive. The newspaper articles remain in archives. The lesson persists for those who choose to learn it. Fort Wayne's experience warns against complacency and deferred maintenance. The story ends in the present, where the Children's Zoo operates under standards unimaginable in 1952. Metal fatigue is monitored. Redundant systems prevent single points of failure. Staff receive training in emergency protocols. Harold's death contributed to a culture where his fate cannot recur. That is the best memorial he could receive.